Hello and welcome to my very first video on phonology. In this video I'll be talking about the sounds in human languages. Now the sounds that we use are actually more organized than we normally think of by a number of traits, but the most basic dichotomy, as I'm sure you know, is between vowels and consonants. Now the comprehensive set of all of the sounds that are used in human language are generally recorded with something called the International Phonetic Alphabet. This is based on the Latin alphabet, which, in case you don't know, is the alphabet that we use to write English. I'm not going to go over it comprehensively here, but I would definitely recommend browsing the IPA if you have a serious interest in linguistics. And now, starting with vowels, vowels are organized on this chart here, with open vowels like ah on this side, closed front vowels like e in this corner, and closed back vowels like oo in this corner. And now, unlike consonants, vowels are a spectrum. You could, in theory, pronounce any infinitesimal point on this chart, but for most purposes, they are distinguished into certain units, and those are the units that are represented here. Now, the other thing you may notice is that symbols on here are organized in pairs. For any given point, there's a certain symbol on the left and a certain symbol on the right. This has to do with something called rounding. On this chart, unrounded vowels are on the left and rounded vowels are on the right. Let me give you an example. That's the difference between a sound like a and a sound like now these sounds are kind of similar. If you can't tell, the difference is that when I pronounce I have my lips pulled together, sort of in the shape of an O. But the inside of my mouth is still shaped much the same way as when I pronounce A. Theoretically, technically, any point on here could be pronounced both unrounded and rounded, though sounds on this side of the chart are much more commonly pronounced unrounded, and sounds on this side of the chart are much more commonly pronounced rounded. In addition to just the normal vowels you see on here, there are also things called sonorants. That is, sounds like n, oo. These are sounds that we often think of as consonants, but which can function as the vowel in a syllable. We actually have these in English, although many English speakers are surprised by that. For instance, in the word better. The second vowel sound in that is not a vowel sound, and then an R, it's just better. That is an example of a sonorant that we use in English, though in many languages they're not just a vowel, they don't just come from a vowel before a consonant, but they're actually distinguished as vowels in their own right. Now, consonants. This is a chart of all pulmonic consonants. I'll get to what that means in a minute. And on this side, on the top, is the list of different places of articulation. That's the difference between sounds like p, t, and k. Now, these sounds are produced in much the same way. I'm momentarily stopping air and then releasing it again. The difference, though, is that when I pronounce p, I'm stopping the air with just my lips. When I pronounce t, I'm stopping the air with the tip of my tongue against the roof of my mouth or my palate. And when I pronounce k, that's actually stopping it with a constriction in the throat. Now, on the left side here is the various manners of articulation, and that's the difference between sounds like n, t, and s. Now, these are all pronounced with the tip of my tongue right up against my palate. The difference, though, is that when I pronounce n, I'm restricting a lot of the sound, and most of it is actually resonating out through my nose. When I pronounce t, as I said before, I'm momentarily stopping the air and then releasing it. And when I pronounce s, I'm obstructing the air so that it makes a sound, but I'm not actually stopping it, so that it continues flowing over my tongue. Now you'll also notice that, like on the vowel chart, sounds here come in pairs. The pairs on here have to do with voicing. The one on the left is unvoiced, and the one on the right is voiced. That's like the difference between s and z. Now, if you can't tell, the difference is that when I pronounce z, I'm vibrating my vocal cords in my throat. And if you pronounce the two sounds consecutively, you'll notice that you're not really changing the position of your mouth much, but you might feel a little buzzer kick in at the base of your throat, and that's your vocal cords. Most of these sounds in the middle here are commonly pronounced both unvoiced and voiced, but all of the liquids and trills down here, and for the most part the nasals up here, are always pronounced voiced. Now, as I said, those are all pulmonic consonants. There are also other types of consonants. Most languages, about 80%, only use pulmonic consonants, and another set may use consonants that are not pulmonic but may not distinguish them from pulmonic consonants. That is to say, these sorts of consonants are much more rare, and as far as I know, they're not used in any real major languages. Implosives, I can't even pronounce to give you an example, but they're organized in much the same way as the pulmonic consonants that I just showed you. But instead of expelling air from the mouth, they're actually produced by lowering the glottis as the sound is produced, which draws air back down the throat. And then there's ejective consonants, which are even more similar to pulmonic consonants, except that there's a short pause, there's a stop. It doesn't flow straight into the vowel. So something like ta or ta, that's ejective. And then there are click sounds. These are infamous for their use among certain South African tribes. I can't give you a really good example of a click, but they're sounds that are like. Now these are also sort of organized along those places of articulation that I showed you, though not as strictly. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is something called sound symbolism. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that certain sounds in a word may convey meaning in and of themselves, and that a word is not just an arbitrary assortment of sounds. Now, this is an idea that's not really well studied or defined. It's definitely something to trust your own ear about as much as any study or anything. The most well-known example of this is something called the Boba-Kiki effect. There was a study conducted where islanders from some island, I forget where, were shown these two shapes. And they had to name one of them Kiki and one of them Boba. Now, the majority of the islanders, and in fact a majority of people, refer to the one on the left as Kiki and the one on the right as Boba. And not coincidentally, English speakers may often refer to the one on the left with words like spiky and the one on the right with words like wobbly or bubbly. And obviously these are words that contain a lot of the same sounds as the names Boba and Kiki themselves. Now this is definitely a very obvious or idealized example of sound symbolism, but it exists in real spoken language too. An example that pertains to English is the difference between words like step and stamp, or between tap and tramp. Now the ones with M's they mean things that sound louder. Stepping is quieter than stamping, and tapping is quieter than tramping. The most blatant instance of sound symbolism in language is onomatopoeia. I'm sure you've heard of this. It's words that don't carry a real meaning but are just meant to imitate sounds, like bang or pow. Then there's something called phonomime, which is sort of between onomatopoeia and regular words. This is a word that does have a real semantic meaning, but is kind of based on sounding like some real sound. For instance, the Mandarin Chinese word for cat is Mao. Now, that, not coincidentally, sounds kind of like the sound a cat makes when it meows. Also, not coincidentally, the sound or the word that we use in English to describe the sound that a cat makes is similar to the Mandarin word for cat. A little bit more detached from reality is something called psychomime, which is a word that, even though it is not based on an actual sound, still very directly and obviously elicits this imagery of sound symbolism. Psychomimes are used much more in Japanese and Korean than any other language I know of. They're words like the Japanese word yobo yobo, which means weak or wobbly with age. Of course, there aren't a lot of old people going around wobbling, actually sounding like yobo yobo, but you can see how the image of an old person wobbling around might relate to the sounds of yobo yobo. There's a universal connection there. The people speaking any language will sort of sense, even if you can't really put your finger on it. And this is an interesting psychological phenomenon, and definitely something to consider when you're creating your languages. And that is all I have for this video. The next video I will be making in this set on phonology will be about syllable structure and accents. As always, comment with any requests, suggestions, ideas, critiques, and subscribe.